Sophie had always felt like she was meant for something greater. Even as a little girl, she dreamed of grand adventures, of castles and dragons, of secret kingdoms hidden just beyond the horizon. Willowbrook, a quaint town nestled between lush green hills and a sparkling river, was the perfect backdrop for a child like her. The town, with its colorful cottages, blooming gardens and cheerful residents, often felt like a fairy tale. Yet Sophie's life was far from simple. Raised by her grandfather Harold after her mother's untimely death, Sophie knew a love that was deep and protective. But it was also suffocating. Harold, though loving, was fiercely protective of Sophie, especially when it came to her father, Thomas. Sophie had never met him. According to Harold, Thomas had been reckless, abandoning his family and leaving Sophie and her mother to fend for themselves. Harold's stories painted a picture of a man who had been selfish and careless, the kind of man who wasn't worth the love of a child. The tales Harold told Sophie were always wrapped in bitterness, the hurt of a man who had never forgiven his brother's choices. With each story, Sophie's heart ached. She loved her grandfather deeply, but there was a part of her that wanted to know more about the father she'd never known. Was he truly the villain Harold made him out to be? Or was there something more to the story? For years, Sophie lived within the walls of her grandfather's house, surrounded by these stories, these half-truths. She grew up under the weight of them, trying to navigate the complexities of her identity without any clear sense of who her father truly was. Her heart was torn, caught between the love Harold showed her and the growing questions she had about the man who had supposedly abandoned them. The summer days were long, filled with endless walks through the meadows that bordered Harold's property, and Sophie spent those hours lost in thought, lost in a world of fantasy. Her imagination soared, filling the gaps where the truth had failed to take root. She imagined herself as a knight, her sword gleaming in the sunlight, ready to fight dragons in the far-off lands of her dreams. She imagined herself as a queen, ruling over a kingdom where peace reigned and the people were happy, a place where no one was abandoned and love was always enough. But the questions about her father never ceased. She found herself asking, who was Thomas? Why did he leave? Did he ever love me? One rainy afternoon when Sophie was 12, she found herself rummaging through Harold's old desk. It had always been a treasure trove of forgotten relics, bits of history that seemed to have been left untouched for decades. Harold, a man of many stories, had an affinity for holding on to the past, and Sophie, ever curious, had long made a habit of exploring his old papers. She hoped to find some new relic, something that would spark her imagination, but instead she found something much more significant. At the back of one drawer, hidden behind old receipts and letters covered in dust, Sophie discovered a hidden compartment. It was a small drawer, almost invisible, tucked away under a pile of old maps. Her heart raced with the thrill of uncovering something secret. With shaking hands she pulled it open, revealing stacks of yellowed paper. They were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to her. Sophie held the first letter with reverence, her fingers brushing over the delicate paper. It was unmistakably from her father, Thomas. The ink had faded with time, but the words, though blurry in places, were unmistakable. The first letter she opened read, "If you're reading this, I hope I haven't lost you completely. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you and your mother. But Sophie, I need you to understand that leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done. There are things you don't know, things that I can't explain. But please know I have never stopped thinking about you. Every day I wonder what you look like, what kind of person you've become. And I hope that one day when the time is right, we can find each other again." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. She reread the letter, her mind spinning with emotions she couldn't quite process. This wasn't the man Harold had described. This wasn't the villain she had imagined. This was a father, one who was lost, who regretted his choices, who had never stopped loving her. She opened another letter, then another. Each one was filled with similar sentiments, expressing deep regret and longing. Thomas spoke of circumstances beyond his control, of mistakes made in desperation, of his love for Sophie that never wavered. He spoke of how he missed her, of how he had never wanted to leave. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she read the letters. She had always believed Harold's version of the story. She had accepted it as the truth, never questioning the narrative. But now, these letters, these words from her father, shook the foundation of everything she had ever believed. Why had Harold kept these from her? Why had he chosen to protect her from the truth? The pain of betrayal surged through Sophie's chest. She felt as if the ground beneath her was shifting, as if the very earth she stood on was unsteady. Her grandfather, the man who had raised her, had lied to her. He had kept these letters hidden for all these years, keeping her from knowing her father, from knowing the truth. Her head swam with 1,000 questions, each one more urgent than the last. Why had Harold told her such a terrible story about Thomas? Was he trying to protect her, or was there something more to it? And what did this mean for her? Who was she really? Sophie spent the rest of the day in a daze, lost in thought, holding the letters close. The next day she decided she would confront Harold. She had to know the truth. She couldn't live with this uncertainty anymore. That night, as the rain pattered softly against the windows, Sophie gathered her courage. She marched to Harold's study, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this conversation would change everything. When she entered, Harold looked up, startled by the determination in her eyes. "Grandpa," Sophie said, her voice trembling but firm. "Why did you keep these letters from me? Why did you lie to me about my father?" Harold's face drained of color, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he sank into his chair, rubbing his face in frustration. "I thought I was protecting you, Sophie," he admitted, his voice soft. "I thought that if you knew the truth about your father, it would hurt you too much. I didn't want you to feel abandoned, to feel that pain I felt when he left. He was reckless, selfish, and I didn't want that for you." Sophie's heart ached at the pain in her grandfather's voice. She understood his fears, but the truth was undeniable now. "But Grandpa," she said, her voice breaking, "I deserve to know my father. I deserve to know who I am." Tears welled in Harold's eyes, but he didn't speak. Sophie, unable to hold back the flood of emotions any longer, turned and stormed out of the room, clutching the letters to her chest. She needed air. She needed to think. The rain had stopped, leaving the world fresh and quiet as Sophie walked through the garden, her thoughts spinning. The storm inside her heart had only just begun. Sophie's heart was a battlefield. The discovery of her father's letters had torn down the walls of her carefully constructed world, and the truth, raw and unrelenting, was now there, demanding to be faced. She had never felt such a storm of emotions, a mixture of anger, confusion, sorrow, and even a spark of hope. But amid the swirling chaos, there was a fire that burned brighter than the rest, the desire to understand who her father really was. That night she could hardly sleep. The letters she had found weighed heavily in her hands, their ink-stained pages full of a love she had never known, a love her grandfather had kept hidden. Harold's silence on the matter only deepened her sense of betrayal. How could he have kept this from her? Was it truly protection, or was there more to the story? The next morning, Sophie made up her mind. She couldn't let this go any longer. It wasn't just about her father anymore, it was about reclaiming her own identity, the truth that had been stolen from her for so many years. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to her: Thomas. But she didn't know where to begin. Sophie's thoughts kept returning to the last letter she had read. Thomas had written that he wanted to see her, that he had been searching for her. For years she had fantasized about this moment, dreaming of the day she would meet her father. But now that the moment seemed within reach, she felt a strange knot in her stomach. She had imagined their reunion 1,000 times, but the reality was so much more complicated. What if the man in the letters wasn't the man she would meet? What if he wasn't what she had hoped for? The doorbell rang just as Sophie was about to leave for town, her thoughts still swirling in confusion. The sound of it startled her, and she rushed to answer, her heart already racing. It was Lucas, her grandfather's brother, and the sight of him caught Sophie off guard. He was out of breath, his face drawn with worry. "Sophie," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to talk. Your father, he's in trouble. He's been looking for you, and there are people after him." Sophie's pulse quickened. The words didn't make sense, not at first. It felt like something out of a dream. After all these years of believing her father had abandoned her, here he was, searching for her, needing her. "What's going on?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Lucas looked around cautiously, his eyes scanning the quiet street. "I don't have all the details, but I know enough. They're after him, and they won't stop until they find him. Sophie, we need to go. He's waiting for you." Sophie felt the weight of the moment settle on her. This was it. Her father, the man she had longed to meet for so long, was not just a distant memory or a shadow in her mind anymore. He was real. And his life was in danger. "Take me to him," Sophie said, her voice steady with newfound determination. Lucas nodded, relief washing over his face. "Come on. We don't have much time." The three of them, Sophie, Lucas, and Thomas, met at an old courthouse on the outskirts of Willowbrook. It was a place long abandoned, a relic of the past where secrets had once been buried, and Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous was about to unfold. The air was thick with tension as they arrived, and Sophie's mind raced with questions. When they stepped into the dilapidated courthouse, the last thing Sophie expected was the menacing figures that awaited them. A group of cloaked individuals stood around, their faces obscured by shadows. The scent of danger hung heavy in the air, and Sophie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. These were not the people she had imagined when she thought of meeting her father. "Stay behind me, Sophie," Thomas whispered urgently, stepping in front of her. His posture was protective, but his eyes betrayed the fear he was trying to mask. "What do they want?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They want money," Thomas replied, his tone tight with frustration. "Debts from the past, things I can't escape. But don't worry. I won't let them hurt you." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and confusion flooding her mind. She had never pictured her first meeting with Thomas like this. This wasn't the reunion she had imagined, the warm embrace, the joyful tears. No, this was a battle, a fight for survival. Suddenly, one of the men stepped forward, his voice cold and threatening. "You owe us, Thomas. And now your daughter has become part of the debt." Sophie's blood ran cold. What did they mean? How was she involved in all of this? Before anyone could react, the situation escalated. Fists flew, the sound of blows landing heavy in the air. Sophie stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as chaos erupted around her. Then something inside her snapped. For so long, Sophie had felt like she was at the mercy of others. The stories her grandfather had told, the lies she had been fed, the confusion that had clouded her sense of self. But now, standing in the middle of this fight, surrounded by shadows and lies, she realized that she had power. She had a voice. And she wasn't going to let fear hold her back anymore. "Enough!" Sophie shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm not afraid of you. This isn't about debt or past mistakes. This is about my family, my life." Her words hung in the air, heavy and defiant, surprising even herself. The room fell into an eerie silence, the men pausing in their movements, caught off guard by the force of her declaration. Sophie's heart raced, but she didn't back down. This was her moment. The moment when the truth would no longer be hidden. "We're not going to let you hurt him," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a newfound strength. "We're standing together." Thomas and Lucas stood behind her, and the bond between them felt unbreakable in that moment. The attackers, unsure of how to proceed, hesitated. The battle didn't end right away, but the tide had shifted. Sophie had taken control. As the skirmish settled into tense stillness, Sophie's thoughts shifted. For the first time in her life, she truly understood the weight of the family she had longed for, the one she had never known, the one she had found. Her father, flawed as he was, had never abandoned her. He was fighting for her just as she had fought for him. And just as the last of the attackers retreated into the shadows, Sophie knew this was only the beginning. The truth, the whole truth, was still out there. And she would uncover it no matter what. As the dust settled, Sophie turned to Thomas, her eyes wide with both fear and excitement. "We need to find out who's behind this," she said, her voice filled with resolve. Thomas nodded, his face grim. "We will. And we'll face it together." For the first time, Sophie felt the weight of the past begin to lift. She was no longer a girl lost in confusion. She was a daughter, a fighter, ready to face whatever truths awaited her. And whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. In the courthouse, as the last remnants of danger faded, Sophie stepped forward, a fierce resolve in her heart. This was her story now, and she would write it. The days after the confrontation in the courthouse felt like a blur to Sophie. The shock of meeting her father, the danger they had faced together, it all still echoed in her mind. But what lingered more than anything else was the burning question that had fueled her every step. Who was Thomas really? The man she had just met, the one who had fought to protect her, was still a stranger in so many ways. The battle with the men had been just one layer of the storm that was swirling around her. The letters she had found in Harold's desk, letters from her father, were full of emotion and regret. But they didn't answer everything. There were still too many gaps. Why had Thomas disappeared? What had happened that led him to leave his family behind all those years ago? And why had Harold twisted the truth into such a dark narrative? Sophie spent her nights going over the letters again and again, trying to piece together the fragments of her father's life. Each page felt like a puzzle, every word, every sentence revealing a piece of a man she didn't truly know. She wanted to believe the love he had written about, but the doubts lingered. The reality of what they had faced, the danger, the violence, began to settle in. She couldn't ignore it. It was clear that Thomas's past was more complicated than she had ever imagined. But no matter how much confusion surrounded him, he was still her father. And Sophie knew deep down that she had to keep searching for the truth, no matter how messy it was. One afternoon, when the sun hung low over Willowbrook, Sophie decided it was time. She couldn't continue living in the shadows of her grandfather's story or her own uncertainties. She needed answers. So she turned to the one person who might hold them, Lucas. She found him in the town square, sitting at a bench by the fountain, looking pensive. His usually warm expression was now clouded with concern. "Lucas," Sophie said, taking a seat beside him. "I need to know everything. About Thomas. About the past." Lucas didn't look at her right away, but after a long pause he sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sophie, I've been hoping you'd ask me about this. It's time, I suppose. You deserve to know." Sophie's heart raced as she braced herself for what was coming. She had lived with so many unanswered questions for so long, but now, facing the truth seemed both terrifying and necessary. "I'll tell you everything I know," Lucas began. "But remember, it's not my story to tell, it's Thomas's. And he's not the same man he used to be. I don't know all the answers either, but I can give you the pieces. Just don't expect them to fit perfectly right away." Sophie nodded, her throat tight with anticipation. "Thomas wasn't always the man you saw when we met. He had dreams, big dreams once. He was in love with your mother, deeply in love. But things were never easy for them. Your grandfather, Harold, he never trusted Thomas, always thought he was too reckless. Too wild. But your mother believed in him. She thought they could make it work, despite everything." Lucas paused, as if sorting through the memories. "But something happened, something I don't fully understand. Thomas, he got involved in something he shouldn't have. Some bad people, Sophie. They weren't just after money, they wanted something bigger. And your father, he got caught in the middle." Sophie's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. What could be bigger than money? Her father's life had been a web of complications, and now she understood that his absence wasn't just a matter of choice, it had been forced upon him. "Did he leave us because of those people?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Lucas shook his head. No, not exactly. He didn't want to leave. But he had to. For your safety. And your mother's. The people he was dealing with, they didn't care who they hurt to get what they wanted. He was trying to protect you both, but in doing so he made choices that pushed him further away from you. I know it must seem like he abandoned you, Sophie, but he didn't. He had no choice." Sophie's chest tightened with the weight of his words. She felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had been fighting for their safety, fighting for a future they couldn't see at the time. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a sacrifice. "But Harold," Sophie whispered, "why did he make it worse? Why did he tell me that my father didn't love me, that he was selfish?" Lucas's face darkened. "Harold, he never forgave Thomas for leaving. It broke him. He couldn't accept that Thomas was doing what he thought was best. And I think he believed that if he told you the worst about your father, it would protect you from being hurt later. But in the process, he poisoned you against the very man who had always loved you." Sophie's mind swirled with this new information. Her grandfather, the man who had raised her, had been trying to protect her, but in doing so he had caused more damage than good. The lies, the secrecy had clouded her life for so long. But now, as she sat beside Lucas, with the truth beginning to take shape, she realized that this was the moment to move forward. She couldn't undo the past, but she could choose to confront it and rebuild the future. "I have to tell Thomas," Sophie said, determination filling her voice. "I need to let him know I understand. That I'm ready to know the truth." Lucas gave her a sad smile. "That's brave, Sophie. But you should know your father, he's not ready to face everything either. There are pieces of his story that he hasn't told anyone, not even you. It's going to take time for him to trust again." "I'm willing to wait," Sophie replied, her voice steady. "I just want to understand him. And I need him to understand me." Lucas nodded approvingly. "You're stronger than you know. And you're not alone in this. You have Thomas, you have me, and now you have the truth." Sophie stood up, her mind clearer than it had ever been. The storm in her heart had settled into something more manageable, a fierce resolve to fight for her family and herself. That night, as Sophie sat alone with the letters from her father in her hands, she knew what she had to do. She would take these words, these broken, fragmented pieces of a man she had never known, and forge a new understanding of who he was. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer afraid. She had discovered a part of herself she hadn't known existed, the courage to face the truth no matter how painful. The next morning, Sophie found Thomas by the river, his gaze distant as he stared out over the water. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had waited for, the moment of reckoning. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with every word. "I need to talk to you. I know what happened. I understand now. I understand why you left." Thomas turned, his face softening as he met her eyes. "Sophie?" He paused, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over his features. "I never wanted to hurt you. I've been so afraid of losing you." "I'm not going anywhere," Sophie said, her voice steady. "We still have time. And I want to know you. All of you." In that moment, Sophie felt the weight of the years lift just a little. The truth wasn't easy and it wouldn't come without its struggles, but it was a beginning. It was the start of something new. And for the first time in her life, Sophie knew she was no longer defined by the lies that had once controlled her. She was forging her own path, one built on honesty, on love, and on the strength to confront the past. The days that followed the confrontation at the courthouse felt like they were pulling Sophie through a whirlwind of emotions, but the world around her was beginning to settle. The truth had been laid bare, and though it hadn't been easy, Sophie felt the weight lifting from her heart. The final barrier between her and her father had been broken. Now they had the chance to rebuild. She spent hours talking to Thomas, asking him about everything, the past, the present, the choices he had made and the ones he hadn't. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. Thomas wasn't the villain Harold had painted him to be. He was human, filled with mistakes and regrets, but also love and hope. And Sophie, though deeply hurt by the years lost, understood the sacrifices he had made. They had both been victims of a story twisted by fear and misunderstanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Sophie and Thomas walked side by side along the meadows she had once explored as a child. The wildflowers danced in the wind, their petals scattering like the fragments of Sophie's past that were slowly being pieced together. "I never meant to hurt you, Sophie," Thomas said, his voice full of quiet regret. "I thought leaving was the only way to keep you safe. I've regretted that choice every day." Sophie stopped walking and looked at him. Her heart, once filled with so much anger and confusion, was now opening in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I know, Dad," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I forgive you. I can't change the past, but we can make the future better. Together." Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, the weight of those years of guilt finally lifting. "I want to be the father you deserve, Sophie. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the time I lost." With every word they shared, Sophie felt the distance between them closing. It wasn't instant. Forgiveness and healing never are. But they were walking toward something new, something bright and full of possibility. Meanwhile, Harold's struggle with his own guilt was unfolding behind closed doors. He had spent years living with the burden of his lies, protecting Sophie in a way he thought was best but ultimately harming her. It wasn't just Sophie who had been scarred by his actions, it was him too. His own choices had kept him trapped in a prison of regret. One evening, Harold approached Sophie. The air between them was thick with uncertainty, but this time, Sophie didn't feel the same anger she once had. Instead, she met him with understanding. She knew the road to reconciliation wouldn't be easy, but it was worth walking. "I was wrong, Sophie," Harold said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own remorse. "I kept those letters from you because I thought I was protecting you. But I was only hurting you. I've wasted so much time and I don't know how to make it right." Sophie looked at her grandfather, his face a reflection of the pain he had carried for so long. "We all make mistakes, Grandpa. It's what we do after that counts." The two of them sat together for hours talking about the past and all the things that had been left unsaid. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. Slowly they began to rebuild. They knew it would take time to mend the fractured trust between them, but they were willing to try. In the weeks that followed, Sophie, Thomas, and Harold worked to create a new foundation, one based on honesty, love, and understanding. They spent time together as a family, not as they had been but as they could be. Sophie found herself laughing again, truly laughing, as she and Thomas worked on painting murals in the town square, telling the stories they had never been able to share before. Sophie's art became a reflection of their healing, a testament to the power of truth and the beauty of second chances. The paintings she created were full of vibrant colors, capturing both the pain and the joy of the journey they had all been on. Her work soon found its way into local galleries, and people came to admire her pieces, not just for their beauty, but for the depth of emotion they held. As for Lucas, he remained a steady presence in Sophie's life, offering support and guidance when needed. Their friendship grew stronger as they both navigated the complexities of their families and their own identities. He had been there for Sophie when she needed him most, and now he stood by her side as they both embraced the future, hand in hand. But the healing didn't stop there. Willowbrook itself began to change. The town that had once been shrouded in quiet whispers and unspoken truths became a place where stories of redemption and reconciliation were shared. People began to open up to one another, sharing their own hidden fears and long-buried regrets. The town had always been quaint, filled with charm and beauty, but now, it was also a place of hope, a place where even the darkest of pasts could be illuminated by the light of truth. Sophie, now stronger and wiser, took her place within that community. She no longer felt like the girl caught between two worlds, torn between the love of her father and the protection of her grandfather. She had found her own voice and with it, a path forward. One evening as the sun set over the town, Sophie stood at the edge of the river, looking out at the sparkling water. Her thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought her here, to this moment of peace and resolution. She had fought through the darkness, through the lies and the pain, and had emerged on the other side. "I used to think the world was full of shadows," she whispered to herself, "but now I see that light can always find its way through." And as the last rays of the sun kissed the earth, Sophie felt the truth of her words deep in her heart. She had reclaimed her story, her family, and her future. The past was no longer a chain holding her back, it was the foundation upon which she would build the life she deserved.